There we go. The recording has begun. So on this Sunday, January 31st, 2021, we are gathered for the first of a series in a year of combating anti-Black racism to explore solutions with our wonderful panelists who are joining us here today as it pertains to economic mobility for Black people. This series was inspired by last year's tragic events, which is marked by the death of George Floyd. May he rest in peace, sparking solidarity protests across the world, leading to widespread interest in anti-Black racism. Our goal as organizers across the diaspora are to continue those conversations because one, this conversation is not relegated to a prescribed moment in time and should not be forgotten as we move on from the crazy year that was 2020. Two, to encourage continued action. And three, to acknowledge anti-Black racism is a global phenomena and to understand better how it manifests differently in different places. So with today's topic of economic mobility, I am so thrilled to be in such great company of you all who have chosen to join us today, and especially our panelists, to learn more about the possibilities of economic freedom for Black people wherever they are in the world. And I'm really excited about the conversations we'll have and the insights that will be gained. The topic of economic mobility is a question that has driven much of how I navigate my career as a former facilitator of youth entrepreneur endeavors at a Pan-African school in South Africa, as a former Federal Reserve researcher and currently co-founder and COO of the Sadie Collective, which is the first and only organization dedicated to the advancement of Black women in economics, finance, data science, and public policy. And also, of course, on a personal front as a Malian American Black Muslim woman in America. So I'm thrilled to be here and to learn alongside you all and to discuss the specific nuances of economic mobility as it pertains to the regions that will be represented today. So to get us started, we will get acquainted with our phenomenal panelists who bring a vast variety of experiences, of expertise and perspectives on encouraging economic mobility, whether it's from a macroeconomic lens or from a more micro lens with working directly with people on the ground. So we'll get started with Kyle. You can introduce yourself by your name, organization, and the region that you'll be focusing on today.
Sure, thanks, Fanta, and thanks for inviting me here. My name is Kyle Moore. I'm an economist at the Program on Race and Ethnicity in the Economy at the Economic Policy Institute, which is based in DC. I am calling in from Wheaton, Maryland, where it is snowing a little bit outside. And I'm focused on mostly US domestic policy, racial economic disparities within the US. So.
Thank you, Kyle. Next up, we have Arlene.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on the panel. My name is Arlene Gordon-Bray. I live in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I have actually two things that take up all of my time, which one is I work for a rural school system in Eastern North Carolina called Edgecombe County Public Schools as a community and engagement partner. And then I also have co-founded a virtual co-working space and open tech innovation space called the Twin Counties Catalyst Collab. So the region I'll be focused on here is really going to be around the American rural South, and providing some anecdotes in the work that I do every day to what Kyle is going to brilliantly bring from the very macro lens.
Fantastic. It's a pleasure to have you both here. Next up, we have Anna.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Anna Bethune, and I currently work as Director of Impact and Research at Datum Impact. Datum is based in Lagos, Nigeria, and we work across 5 critical areas to development, so health, education, entrepreneurship, gender equality, and quality of life. So I'm actually calling from Lagos, Nigeria, but I'm Jamaican born and raised, and I was a former economics researcher at the Edward Seager Research Institute. So I will be talking about Jamaica and the Caribbean at large.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us today, Anna. Next up, we have Chinwe.
Hi. So my name is C.Egwim. I'm an economist, author, and advocate, and I currently work at FBN Quest. That's the investment banking arm of FBN Holdings as the senior economist. And my focus will be geared towards Nigeria.
Great, it's a pleasure to have you. And last but not least, we have Veneri.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vannery Kong. I work for a cybersecurity firm here in Washington, DC, but I have founded the U.S. ASEAN Youth Council. My mother's a refugee from Cambodia, so I'm interested in increasing those relations as well as providing opportunities for people of color in the region, both in the private and public sectors.
Fantastic. So we shared a few questions with all of our panelists about economic mobility. And those questions were, what is the current state of economic mobility in the region you're discussing today? What are some challenges? What are some growth opportunities? What is being done currently by people, by organizations, and by the government? And also, what does success look like? So once, anti-Black racism is no longer a thing for the region that you're focusing on, as it relates to having access to economic opportunities, what is success? And last but not least, how can we all here support your work? How can we amplify it? And what are the work of other great leaders in this space? So to get us started, we'll have Anna lead, and then have each person answer a bit about these different questions and facets, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A where you all can ask any questions that you have. And feel free to use the chat if you hear anything that resonates with you, or if you hear any points of intersection that you'd like to learn more about, definitely use the chat and we'll be sure to make it easy for connections to be made. And then I'll be sharing some next steps about where this conversation can go from here. So we'll have Anna start us off.
Oh, so much pressure to go first. It's like we have to set the tone, right?
No pressure
so you want me to touch on Sunday. You want me to touch on all the questions in one go right now?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. So, when we talk about economic mobility, we're also thinking about inequality and poverty. So I'm going to share some statistics to give you an understanding of what the state of Jamaica is. The proportion of people living below the poverty line in Jamaica is about 19.3%. To put those numbers in perspective, another Caribbean country, Barbados, which has the lowest poverty rate in the region, is 14%. And on the other side, Guyana, which has the highest poverty rate in the region, is 43%. When we compare that to Nigeria, where I currently live, the poverty rate is approximately 40%, right? So the poverty rate has remained kind of stable. It's decreased a little bit over time because the GDP per capita has marginally increased. But because of COVID, it is expected that the poverty rate will increase. And a lot of it is because the employment rate that was 7.3% before COVID is actually expected to double. COVID has hit the tourism sector really hard in Jamaica. Tourism is one of the major earners of foreign exchange behind remittances. So when you think about tourism taking a dive and then remittances also taking a dive because everywhere has been affected by COVID-19, you can kind of see why the economy is contracting and why people are even at higher risk of falling back into the poverty trap, right? So these are some of the challenges that we're facing. There were some projected numbers that said about 50,000 employees lost their jobs in the tourism sector. And when you think about the labor force in Jamaica, Jamaica is about roughly 3.3 million people, small country, I know, but with a labor force of about 1.5 million, right? So the Prime Minister said recently that vaccination is going to have to happen at a really slow rate. At the end of this year, only 16% of the population will be vaccinated. At the end of next year, an additional 16% will be vaccinated, which brings up to a wonderful total of 32% of the population being vaccinated at the end of 2022, right? And a lot of that is coming back to the cost of the vaccines and some of our richer neighbors kind of, taking over the distribution of vaccinations. And as we couple that with remittance flows kind of decreasing over time, you can see the kind of situation that we're in. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing. So I can speak a little bit about the opportunities, and these are in a way theoretical opportunities, things that the government could really think about to implement. And I'm going to say something that's a little controversial, but I do think universal basic income is something that we should be talking about. UBI, as I'll call it in short, is people have very different definitions of UBI, but generally it is an income support mechanism, right? And it's intended to reach the bottom of the population. And in some cases it can have conditions, in others it might not. Different countries have implemented it in different ways. And I think universal basic income that complements other forms of social protection, so health insurance, would mean that it would provide needed income for persons who are at the bottom, right? And it can be done through cash transfers to the heads of household. And then you can have social requirements, for example, make sure that your kids are still enrolled in school. You should be actively searching for a job, things like that. UBI is a very controversial topic, so it's something that is a very hot debate topic. So we can get into that later. The other thing that I think is a big opportunity for Jamaica is changing the narrative and engagement around agriculture, right? So agriculture for us only contributes about 66% to the Jamaican economy, but it employs 15% of the labor force. And that 15% are people who basically live in rural areas where poverty is concentrated. So if we focus on building up agriculture, I think that there's a way that we can get back to redistributing income and really thinking about economic mobility for the persons who are finding it difficult to climb the ladder. And then another thing that I think is more of a political topic is rethinking the role of the labor union. In the 1970s, 40% of employees were registered to a labor union, and that number has decreased by half in just 10 years in the 1980s and has decreased since then. Economic mobility is the word economics is in the term, but if you think about the political dimension of it as well, and you're talking about power redistribution, I think allowing people from the bottom to move their way up the ladder also means that we have the conversation about how power should be redistributed within the society. Okay, so the other part that I want to talk about is what is the government doing? So there is a COVID-19 allocation of resources for employees, which has a lovely name called the CARE program. So basically these are cash transfers that go to the most vulnerable, and about 500,000 Jamaicans, and 25 billion Jamaican dollars has been dispersed through that program. And there's also been a reduction of consumption tax. But these kinds of transfer programs, especially when you have a country that has high debt, it doesn't really go all the way. People still need a lot more help. Let's see. So we've spoken a little bit about poverty and inequality. If we think about like inequality in terms of Gini coefficient, the numbers aren't really there. We don't have really current numbers on Gini coefficient, but the 10%, the top 10% of income earners in 2019 took 49% of national income, whereas the bottom 50% took about 13%. So that gives you like an idea of how income inequality, at least, plays out in Jamaica. And I think if we were to talk about, one of the best ways for us to rethink economic mobility, a lot of people will talk about education. And for me, who has her degree in education, I think I have really committed to this idea that education is a great opportunity for people to advance themselves. I'm not going to argue about the idea of everyone who's educated can get ahead. I think we may all agree that meritocracy isn't really what we're living in. But if we think about education as a way for people to skill themselves and then participate in the labor market, there also needs to be a way that we think about how to match the supply and the demand of these skills. So what you see when you're coming out of university or vocational training schools is that the skills that people are developing aren't matched with the skills that different companies or businesses want to hire. And then if we look beyond that, the types of skills that we're developing in Jamaica, for example, they're at the bottom of the value chain. So call centers are being touted as this really innovative, industry that's growing in Jamaica. And there are some benefits to it, right? We are close to North America. English is our national language, and we're in the same time frame. But it's still at the bottom of the value chain. The people who are working in call centers are still not making that much. So we have to think about, how do we then capture other parts of the value chain so that when we're skilling people and they're getting their jobs, they are able to really support their family and not have to do part-time this, part-time that to make ends meet. And then the final question, which is about how can people support your work? Should I say that now or leave it towards the end? Say it now?
Yeah, now it's good.
Okay, cool. So, groups like these, I think, are really important. This series of events, so, as Fanta was saying, this is one of a series of webinars that we'll be hosting over the year. I think if you continue to tune in, and I think if you can join this group, that's actually a really great step forward. We're trying to really build a robust collective, and that's not possible if we don't have a diverse group of people coming in that align with the same values, which is obviously very, very important. So that's a very key step, I think. And if you want to connect with me, you can hit me up on my IG page. I'm Anna P. Beth. You can check out my website, annabethune.com. And I also have a podcast devoted to Black women, and many of the stories coming up this year will showcase the lives and experiences of Jamaican women. So thank you. And the name of the podcast is My Black is Brave.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Anna. And can't wait to start checking out your podcast, and great key way that you shared in terms of how people can be engaged. I'll also note that one of the things that you highlighted is how the Gini coefficient is now all encompassing. So if there are any folks here who are in the policy space, that's also something to keep in mind when we're having this conversation about economics and inequality and how we measure it. So you also shared a variant way for us to look into that, which is looking at percentiles. And then additionally, you've also shared about how a meritocracy isn't what we are operating in. And oftentimes wealth is actually a better indicator of your success, the wealth that your family has for your success and your mobility. So that's also a key takeaway that I wanted to share out as well. Thank you. Next up, we have Kyle, who will be speaking about North America.
Sure, thanks, Fanta. And I guess to be specific, I should say I'm talking about specifically the US, so racial disparities in America. So there are a couple different ways you can think about inequality and economic mobility. There's intergenerational mobility, that's between generations, so from your parents to the children. Then there's intragenerational economic mobility, and that's of course one person moving throughout their life. Are they able to move, to a better position than they were when they started? And there are a few different dimensions you can think of this in. Wealth is one, income is another, employment status factors into those things. And I think when you look at the state of Black America, as a result of 2020 and throughout 2020, there are a lot of headwinds to achieving economic mobility and economic security that were really exacerbated by the the recession that we had and the the coronavirus, right, that precipitated it. When you look at the years leading up to 2020, you almost started to see we had a very long recovery, the longest recovery on record. And that was pretty much due to what the Obama administration was able to do in recovery from the Great Recession. That combined with Fed policy kept interest rates low, and that led to unemployment being able to fall to a level that it was near unseen for the Black community. Despite that, you still saw a nearly 2-to-1 gap in unemployment between Black and white Americans. When the coronavirus hit, that changed for a small amount of time, but it ended up being a bit of a double-edged sword. So stay-at-home orders happened and unemployment pretty much hit everyone equally. White unemployment rose to, I think, 14%. Black unemployment rose to almost 17%. Um, that's about a 1.2 ratio between black and white unemployment. Black people were at that point about 20% more likely to be unemployed than white Americans, which is historically low. That ratio is usually a lot bigger. Um, but since then, since the recession that initially was caused by these stay-at-home orders that were justified, um, since that recession has lengthened, um, and we've gotten into our, I wouldn't even call it a recovery, but unemployment has started to, decrease for these groups. It's fallen a lot faster for white Americans, and by more. So basically, unemployment has fallen by about a point on average every month since April for white workers. For black workers, it's been about 3/4 of a point, such that now I think black unemployment in December was 10% compared to like 6% for white workers. And that's pretty characteristic of racial disparities in the US. When bad things happen in the US, they hit Black America, hits Black America harder, um, and the recovery is slower. And that's a sort of structural reality about the US that it is going to take structural policy to address. And that's one of the big points I want to bring up throughout this conversation is that when we think about things that we can do to improve the economic mobility of Black Americans, we have to be able to move beyond solutions that are focused on individuals. Um, it's not going to be changes in the behavior of individual Black people that leads Black people as a whole towards a place of greater economic mobility. These aren't the things that led white America to have the wealth position that it has today, right? It's not because white Americans somehow know the stock market better or are more financially literate or save more or are better about lending to their relatives. It's simply that they have the resources to be able to do so. And they were afforded the opportunities to build those resources by the federal government through various programs from which Black Americans were excluded. And again, Black Americans don't have those resources because they weren't afforded those opportunities. And in fact, when they have achieved the metrics by which, uh, again, we talked about meritocracy earlier, right? We know about underemployment for Black workers. When Black workers do become educated, they don't have the same returns in the labor market for their education. They don't get the same occupations with the same education. So you have similarly skilled workers who just aren't remunerated in those same ways as compared to their white counterparts. Um, and again, so these are structural issues. So the things that we have to do have to take place at a sort of top-down level, at least from my perspective. Um, so when we talk about things that are happening right now, one huge thing that's going to end up affecting a lot of people, there's a lot of debate about raising the minimum wage to $15 right now, right? This is going to disproportionately help Black workers because Black people disproportionately work at or below the minimum wage. Um, Student loans are another huge headwind for millennials, generally speaking, but for a population of millennials whose parents don't, have $30,000 on in wealth to be able to give them in a down payment to buy their new home, right? Student loans are a significant headwind to moving forward, both within a generation and then, of course, across generations. So, to the extent that we can pursue policies like student loan forgiveness, that would disproportionately help um, Black workers and Black people, depending on how that policy is actually designed. Anna mentioned the UBI. UBI is a great policy that we could look into. Another one that's kind of sits alongside it in the debate. We don't have to debate between these two, but a federal job guarantee is another potential policy that we could pursue. I spoke earlier about the unemployment differences between Blacks and whites. These are consistent trends. If we can find a way to build in a guarantee to a job for all Americans that will, get rid of the unemployment differences and also work as a wage floor that will help people all throughout the pay scale. And when you look at public sector employment today, you see that these are the sorts of jobs where the pay disparities between workers of different groups are the smallest. We know that Black workers and women flock to public service because the private sector does not give them the same sorts of remuneration as their white and male peers. So we can have a system, a federal workers bureau that will, provide people with employment um, that will, again, help with economic mobility for the Black community. Um, I've been speaking for a while, so I want to get to some ways people can support the work in this space. Again, I think the most important thing that people can do is reorient their understanding of where these racial disparities come from, right? It's not individual failures. It is structural conditions that are affecting what certain groups of people get exposed to and what resources they have available to them, right? So that's the big change we can make. And then the thing that you can do, I guess, more in a more tangible sense, um, and this is a bit self-serving, but I'll say check out the work coming out of the progressive think tank space. Economic Policy Institute is doing good work. Washington Center for Equitable Growth is doing good work. The Cook Center at Duke University is doing good work. There are institutes coming out of the New School for Social Research that are doing great work as well. So there are a lot of think tanks that are pumping out this work, especially in the wake of 2020, that is more racially conscious and more aware of the conditions of Black people in the U.S. and less likely to be condescending in its policy prescriptions for that group, which is again a relatively new trend, but it's a good one, and I think we should support that work while it's there. And I'll stop there because I've said enough, I think.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I mean, there's so much to touch on with this question, and you did a really great job in addressing what economic mobility could look like. So far, a key takeaway there is to cite from progressive think tanks and to take a look at that research. And we now will have it passed on to Arlene Gordon.
Hi, everyone. One, I feel like Kyle's already said it, as well as Anna, so I can bounce out of here. Also, I have barely passed way too many econ classes to really be sitting here today. But thank you again. One of the things, I'm actually gonna kind of answer the questions backwards just because of where we were able to leave off with Kyle. And that he, made the point that all of this is structural, right? Like this is structural racism, which is the biggest impediment to economic mobility for Black people in the region. In terms of North America, and specifically when I talk about the American South and focusing on rural communities out there. In saying that, when we talk about like, how can we support the work? It's one that recognizing that structural racism exists across the board in every industry in some way in the United States. And then also recognizing the step of, by making improvements upon these different parts of the system, we are giving more opportunities to create economic mobility for Black Americans, right? So when I say that, my point is that when we talk about health disparities, when we talk about the criminal justice system, when we talk about disparities in education that exists, savings, et cetera, these are all contributors to why we have low economic mobility for our communities. And so when you talk about making any improvements on one of these systems, it does create can create a structural shift that will allow one of those to happen. And so I'm going to give some anecdotal voice to a lot of things that Kyle said, just, based on where we're at, where we are. And also, we exist in a lot of informal networks in rural communities. So accessing those and tapping into that knowledge is always one way to make improvements versus kind of only just hearing out of what we consider to be the true professional voices in this space. When we think about how this shows up in these different ways, so one is I have a student whose father did not have a college degree, and so of course was 75% more likely to actually go to prison, and he did, which then that results to food insecurity happening in the home. So how do I have a child that shows up in one of the schools that I'm in who is hungry and then is unable to learn? In an education system that was based in early 20th century industrial needs and was never designed for Black children in the first place. So the result is I'm gonna have a child that resents school, does not receive a good secondary education, and then is going to try to enter a workforce that does not know how to deal with any of that sort of trauma that exists. They're not gonna have any space for how he might show up differently in his community versus what they consider to be white and professional. They're not going to have any space for the fact that he abhors learning and is not going to respond well to the typical training needs that happen that they've set up because he was a part of a system. He didn't have any Black teachers that were in front of him and exist in these different ways. And so when we talk about this, just gives an example of how the structural racism does not allow social mobility to actually occur. So as I continue to answer backwards here, success looks like access and opportunity for us all to explore something different, right? Access looks like there being more programs being designed with equality in place and to think about equity in the first place, not just built upon traditional systems that we've already seen. In my community right now, it is extremely unlikely for anybody to be able to escape the poverty trap. I work for Title I schools who are just barely trying to get out of the failing category due to interventions from different grant and foundation systems that have tried to help. But then they leave, and my region only has minimum wage manufacturing jobs, which we know will be displaced in less than 5 years due to automation. And I've sat on the boards with everyone else that doesn't believe that our children or our workforce are capable of anything else than jobs that they're already trying to put into offshore markets. So when we talk about what are ways that we can have interventions, it's creating more opportunities for employment. It's creating more opportunities to actually see what something different could look like. It's creating more and new industries and listening to the population of what they want. A lot of times now we're, again, like acting on the individual level and supporting entrepreneurship, which is a great means to social mobility, but we know that's not the be all end all. Yeah, and so I think I'm gonna end there and then pass it on.
Thank you so much for that. So centering equity and listening to the people who are being served. Was that Kathy? Did you want to chime in there? Or maybe that was accidental. Yeah, so lots of takeaways there as well. And something that I wanted to add, as we are centering the conversation on the North America right now, is the concept of Black women best. So the idea is that if the economy works for Black women, it will work for everyone. And the current chief economist for the Department of Labor is Janelle Jones, who has coined that term. So she's someone to definitely look out for. And then on the conversation of the federal job guarantee, which is to build in a guaranteed job for all Americans, this is actually championed by America's first Black economist who was not allowed to actually practice as an economist, but spoke about this and wrote about these issues. And her name is Dr. Sadie Alexander. So that's also something I wanted to put out there. But Janelle Jones, she's the first chief economist of the Department of Labor who is a Black woman. So definitely look out for her work, which looks at centering equity and looking at how we get the economy to work for Black women. When we look at disaggregated data and we see that Black women are actually not having much traction in terms of economic progress. But if we do center them, then we can have an economy that works for all Americans. So just a point I wanted to share there. And next up, we will have Chinwe.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks. So, so I'll just start. I'm going to be focusing on Nigeria, as I said earlier. Now, yeah, the poverty rates are especially high in Africa, and somewhat less appreciated is that economic inequality within African countries also tend to be high. Gender inequality is a prominent reason for all levels of economic inequality, as women tend to get paid lesser than their male counterparts. They do not own properties when you compare them to their male counterparts, and of course have less access to loans, among other reasons. Now, as for Nigeria, economic inequality has reached extreme levels despite it being the largest economy in Africa. Poverty and inequality in Nigeria are not due to lack of resources, but to the ill use and misallocation of such resources. At the root is corruption combined with a political elite that is out of touch with the daily struggles of average Nigerians. Now, when we look at Nigeria's GDP growth rate, and that's pre-COVID-19 pandemic levels, GDP growth had failed to hit 3% year on year, meaning that the growth rate was still below underlying population expansion. Therefore, the impact on employment levels or living standards has not been significant. Before the current recession that we're now facing, Nigeria was still recovering from the recession that took place in 2015. So growth was really fragile. Pockets and purses were being pinched. Inflation rate has steadily accelerated, and the transmission effect into the real economy has been really, quick, very fast. Now, 90 million Nigerians live on less than $1 per day. 1 in every 5 out of school children is out of school in Nigeria. 32% of children under 5 years old suffer from chronic malnutrition. Approximately about half of Nigerian households have had to reduce their food consumption to cope with the COVID-19 crisis. Just to shed some more light on the chronic economic inequality, reports have it that a Nigerian lawmaker is not only one of the highest paid in the world, but has monthly earnings that can pay at least 475 Nigerians the 30,000 Naira monthly minimum wage, which is less than $100, by the way. Yet many Nigerians earning this minimum wage are being owed many months of wages. There are also reports that Nigeria is spending about 40 billion Naira per annum on the pensions of some governors and deputy governors, while many pensioners in the civil service are being owed several months of their pension. Inclusive growth is yet to be established. Gender inequality, poor education, structural deficit, and of course, a weak human capital are some challenges that affect economic mobility in Nigeria. Now, some of my thoughts around solutions. Education must be treated as a human right, and all Nigerian children should have equal access to the best. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that's STEM, must be emphasized. Entrepreneurial skills must also be emphasized. Curriculum should meet the needs of the Nigerian private sector and support agriculture, education, health, manufacturing, banking, technology, and every other important sector of the economy. Deliberate steps towards closing the gender equality gap should be taken. Now, the essence of fully functional vocational and technical institutions cannot be overemphasized. Perhaps polytechnics across the country could be revamped to offer courses that will equip individuals for career paths that are often cited as blue collar and usually captured in the informal sector. For instance, formal education in plumbing, electrical techniques, auto mechanics, carpentry, amongst others. These are usually perceived as inferior. Here in Nigeria and across African countries, I do not know why, but they do generate appreciable income for several individuals in developed economies. And so that's something that requires a lot of attention. Now to the next question. What are things people, organizations, or the government, what are they doing to address these disparities and opportunities? Well, there are a few government interventions which are laudable, but not sufficient. I would say the Central Bank of Nigeria, which I refer to as the CBN, the CBN's Anchor Borrowers Program has been able to assist to an extent. It's expected to empower over 10 million farmers. And I understand that over 1 million farmers have benefited from financial disbursements under this program. That's good, but the impact remains minimal when you look at the economy as a whole. There are programs designed to empower SMEs as well as the youth population with entrepreneurial skills. I'm talking to you from Lagos State right now. The Lagos State Employment Trust Fund has been able to make good strides with regards to this. NGOs, of course, are also making efforts with regards to addressing the disparities. Now, WIMBIZ, which stands for Women in Management, Business and Public Service. I'm a member, I'm an executive council member, has for 20 years now been active with empowering, equipping, and inspiring women to take up space in their respective areas in an attempt to close the gender inequality gap. There are a handful of foundations that pick communities to empower by improving school systems within these communities, empower women, especially widows, with skills to help them generate income for their households. They also equip micro businesses with financial interventions to help them scale, as well as boost economic and financial literacy in general. All of these are important. Now, what does success look like to me, or what will success look like? I would say an economy that is not heavily skewed, properly formalizing the informal and seeing the impact of taxes via proper government capital expenditure in the economy. Everybody should have access to basic needs, so water, food, shelter, mass transport system, at the very least. How can people support my work and the work of leaders in my space? Oh, well, I would say by joining organizations like WIMBIZ that I just mentioned to support programs. There's a platter of programs there, encouraging corporate social responsibility projects across firms. A lot of firms are doing their bit. Also supporting foundations that are doing work in various communities. However, for specifics, I have so many specifics and I would consume so much time if I start listing them. So for specifics, you can connect with me through LinkedIn. My name is C.Egwim. You find me on LinkedIn. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chinwe. And you all should know that she has a book titled Understanding Economic Jargon. And, this space of economics should definitely be more accessible, which is what a lot of my work is about. So check out her work and also her TED Talk. So it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you so much.
And I want to highlight that it's really hard to have such a rich conversation in 1 hour, highlighting all these different regions and their nuances. And what you all can look forward to moving forward is that we'll have regional breakouts, and the future conversations will allow for more nuance in whether we're talking about the United States or Africa, and we'll go even deeper into what the conversations of these regions are on. So we are, coming short on time. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Vannery, and we have a few questions in the chat, which we'll try to get to. And if not, definitely look out for the key takeaways document.
All right, thank you. And I'll be very brief with my responses, but thank you to all the panels. It's definitely, there's so much intersectionality that's going on. But as far as economic mobility in the Asia Pacific region, I'll be focusing on Southeast Asia. The key indicators which prevents economic mobility is due to lack of access to resources, historical context, and also the digital divide and how it's widening due to many causes. So when you look at the history of Southeast Asia, colorism is such a big issue in Asia in general. When you look at what's going on with China and East Asia in particular, you see it in the news during COVID-19, how many African students were being evicted from their homes and being forced to undergo COVID testing, and they were also starving in the streets and everything too. And then when you go and look at what's going on in Southeast Asia, we have so many indigenous groups that due to the amount of melanin that's in your skin, sometimes it can prevent you from getting jobs. It can prevent you from going to school. And then, of course, because there are developing nations, the jobs are only being offered to some of those that are of Chinese descent. Now, some other economic mobility issues is that there's a lack of representation of those that are from these indigenous groups that are in places of power. The Belt and Road Initiative that's being implemented by China is very huge. There's an international gentrification that's going on. I know personally when I go see my family in Cambodia and Phnom Penh, if anyone knows DC rent, it's about $2K. So when you go to these developing nations and they're having those same prices, there's so many people that are getting pushed out of their homes and being put on the streets, and then just like widening the poverty gap as well. Human trafficking is very big in Southeast Asia, whether it's, forced sex labor or just working in inhumane conditions in factories, and then having this forced ideology that people will have to marry out of survival. Even when it comes to educating the youth, what's similar to what Arlene was saying, food deserts are very common in Southeast Asia, a lack of transportation, a lack of costs. Children are having to take over the responsibilities of especially girls having to drop out of school and everything as well. There's a lack of human rights supports as well, especially when there's so much rape, and then there even corruption within the police brutality force. You get men from a lot of the Western societies that will come and, excuse me for being a little crude, but raping young children. And it is very, very disheartening. So when we're on sites like LinkedIn and other sites like the Asia Foundation, they have all these job opportunities, but they're only being accessed to those with the internet connection and those with the computer at home. So that leads me kind of to my next, like what countries are doing. So you have venture capital is booming, the ASEAN region is definitely a very up and coming region in the area. You have the investment from the US, you have investment from China, you have investment from the Russians, the EU, and the UK that are coming up. So there's definitely a lot of money that's flowing in there, but it's not coming to the communities that need it the most. And that's what we're here for. So as someone that is both Black and Southeast Asian, I said, okay, what can we do to help both the Southeast Asian communities, both in the US and in the ASEAN region? And I'm going to touch a little bit on what Kyle mentioned as well. When the Southeast Asians were being brought over to the US during the civil rights movement, they're being placed in high poverty areas. So Southeast Asians here in the US don't really get a chance to go to college or universities. And a lot of our statistics are very similar to those of African Americans. So, there's kind of like what Arlene said, there's high poverty, teenage pregnancy. Even here in the US, some of us struggle with social mobility unless you come from, unless your family came from money during the time when we came over here. So to support, I'm sorry, I tend to jump around, but to support our work, what we try to do with the US ASEAN Youth Council, those that are small businesses that are getting resources from the ASEAN countries, we definitely want to make sure that we're providing a platform where like the Department of State, the United States Trade Representative Office, they have programs to help mentor and provide, also the Small Business Administration, and provide grants to small businesses so they can compete in the global markets. Entrepreneurship, like Arlene stated, is very huge. And then also making sure you're supporting the ed tech firms as well. Coming from a cybersecurity background, those of us that are from Western countries that can just, toss a cell phone and recycle on cell phones, make sure, when you're decide to donate your technology, wipe off all your data, wipe off everything else, and then being able to donate them so children in these and these areas can actually use them and have access to education. Something else that we're actually working on, I'm actually involved in the G20 and G7 summits. So actually actively, what else you can also do is supporting civil society organizations who are advocating in the decision-making room, saying, hey, we need access to money. We need access to cybersecurity to protect the children while they're on the internet. We need access to internet providers who can go into these third world countries and even here in the US to make sure that areas have access to the internet so they can apply for jobs, so they can keep that education going, and then making sure that there's a lot of other NGOs who can provide food and water so children can actually focus on, education, what matters the most.
Thank you. So, wow, yeah, there's definitely a lot of opportunity where there are many challenges, and that's commendable of you, Venari, for starting this council, and definitely want to hear more about how to be engaged with it. So, for everyone who has attended this call and this conversation, for our panelists, thank you so much for taking time on your Sunday to do so. What you can expect moving forward is a key takeaways document that includes clear ways that you can action some of the ideas that were shared here, and also engage directly with our panelists. So if you didn't have a chance to get their social media handles and how to connect with them, you'll have more information in that follow-up. Our next session is going to be on tech and digital literacy, which actually ties really well with some of the concepts and ideas that you were sharing, Venari, and that is also speaking to this broader question of anti-Black racism. So we unfortunately do not have so much time for many questions at the moment. I think we can take one and then we will close out for today. I saw there were some questions in the chat, and okay, so Raj shared a question about cash assistance being incredibly helpful during the pandemic. What are some learnings that can be applied more broadly, even beyond the pandemic? How do we respond to people who prioritize long-term systemic change over addressing immediate needs of Black people, especially those with low income? Great question, right? So it's speaking to this tension between how do we address long-term structural issues versus immediate needs. Is there anyone who'd like to take that?
Yeah, I can say something to that. So there's some extent to which we can we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and I think that we're at a really unique moment with a new administration and a sort of reawakened awareness of racial disparities, such that we can get a lot done soon, right? So there are sort of relief policies that people are thinking about with respect to the pandemic, which are of course important and like need to be prioritized. But at the same time, we can also be laying the groundwork for more transformational policies. And I think when you think about something like raising the minimum wage or setting in a plan to raise the minimum wage, that's something that has a long-term impact, but can even be important relatively soon. And that doesn't necessarily take away from our efforts to do something like getting out relief checks or immediate student loan relief, or even more pertinently, changing OSHA standards so that workers can be safe in the workplace, so that we can get back to some sort of a normal, right? So I think we don't need to necessarily choose which of these we want to do at this particular time. There are a lot of different arms of government, so we can do a number of different things at once, actually, and not necessarily be drawing on one pool of resources. So.
Thank you so much for that, Kyle. I agree with you. And I think we are at a unique point, right, where I've never heard the president of the United States say so often in a speech systemic racism and white supremacy, which is really speaking to the core and the root of some of the problems that we're seeing now. So definitely a space of hope that we can kind of find ourselves in right now. And the solution is multifaceted and both can be implemented at the same time. So thank you all so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure, and we're looking forward to seeing many of you for our next session.
Thank you so much. Great session, everyone.